Hello and welcome back, and that is right, it is data news of the week, but a slightly different. I'm going to mix things up a little bit this week. We're going to focus on CES 2022. That's right, over in Vegas, the 3-day event, semi-digital, semi-physical, was an event that took place earlier this week at the start of 2022, and loads of new tech intended in one shape or form for 2022 was unveiled. Now, obviously, I'm not going to talk about all of the stuff that was there, because to be perfectly frank, some of it is just not channel appropriate, from cars to mobile phones to slightly adult-based content. Let's put that out there immediately. But in the world of data, from switches to hard drives to SSDs to routers and stuff like that, stuff that I generally talk about on the channel a lot, there was some really interesting stuff. And in today's video, I'm going to talk about all of the things during the event that stood out for me, be they tech demos or real products that we're going to see later this year that were unveiled by the brand. So let's start off straight away with routers and switches and networking, because if there was one thing that seemed to dominate all over the shop, it was Wi-Fi 6E. Wi-Fi 6 is something that's now been around for quite a few years, and 6E that takes advantage of that 6 gigahertz band has really been explored and into. And I think a lot of that is because a lot of the hardware manufacturers, and again I am including Mac in this, are seemingly promising to integrate 6E into a lot of their hardware solutions later this year. So therefore, all the other peripheral and a kind of surrounding ambient hardware manufacturers have jumped on board. Now, first and foremost, let's talk about Netgear's releases there, because the three main ones that were unveiled there was Asus, Nighthawk, and TP-Link. The Asus stuff we've kind of already talked about late last year, but the TP-Link and the Netgear stuff was quite intriguing. With Netgear, we saw a new release into the Nighthawk series. That's the RAX E300 Wi-Fi 6E router. It's going to knock around for about $400. And again, there were other prices listed for other regions all over the place. It's a 6 antenna Nighthawk. Those are, Netgear kind of router buyers for gamers. Nighthawk has kind of been the go-to there. And although this router supports Wi-Fi 6E, I've got to say it's not the most outstanding router from them. And it's not even their first router to integrate 6E either. There was some mesh stuff with that Orbi series, which I've always had difficulty kind of falling in love with. But with this new Nighthawk router, 6 antennas built into the sides of that framework there. It's also got a 2.5 GBE port. It's got 5 gigabit ports there, and a potential total bandwidth of 7.8 gigabit of bandwidth there. Now, as good as that all sounds, TP-Link kind of took it one step further, because TP-Link unveiled a huge range of solutions for their Archer series. Now, for those that aren't aware, the Archer series from TP-Link is kind of, I'm not going to say it's they're affordable, because a lot of that stuff is pro-gamer and prosumer, but they've really cut a niche into the market there with a lot of those solutions. And TP-Link, that's always kind of held a slight reputation of being more affordable. I think a lot of their gamer and prosumer solutions have really started to take off quite heavily in, established arenas. Now, there was the Archer AXE200 and AXE300. These are Wi-Fi 6E solutions, unsurprisingly. The first one there, the 200, it's an AX 11000 router there. It's Wi-Fi 6E. It's, using a 6 gigahertz band there. It also has a 10 GBE port and 2.5 GBE port on board. And again, that's largely because of that wider wireless bandwidth opening from 6E. And when you have LAN connected devices and LAN network devices and the shared bandwidth of traffic, as well as people starting to feature greater than gigabit internet connectivity in their homes and businesses now, it's an interesting move forward. And again, although the price tag wasn't talked about in too realistic sense, there was a lot of RRP stuff thrown around. I was really intrigued by this. Now, on that same product family, it's splintered off into lots of different versions. And although I could list them all, what I'm going to focus on there is the E300 that I mentioned there at the beginning. Very similar in architecture, but this time it was an AX16000 device. That's right, potential 16 gigabits per second maximum shared bandwidth across this device. Enormously impressive, with these two kind of router systems coming into 2022, and they're saying within the first and early second quarter of this year, that's going to be some impressive hardware for network junkies and those looking at 6E. Now, the entry point into 6E, obviously there are adapter cards out there, but The adapter cards market for 6E is still very much in its infancy. Now, we talked halfway through this year about D-Link and their USB to Wi-Fi 6 adapter. It was a lovely little USB adapter there, bus powered, boom, stick it in. Congratulations, you could have either a single band 1.2 gigabits per second there on that maximum frequency. It wasn't the total bandwidth, but again, that single connection, which was lovely to see. Now, one of the processors inside that is what made it possible. And there are a lot of brands working on processors, SoCs, that's software on chip, that these little processors there, these are what are making that transition between the protocol of USB and Wi-Fi 6 and 6E possible. And one of those is Realtek. Realtek unveiled the I'm going to have to look at my notes, the RTL8852CE, what a catchy name, is exactly what I just described there. It is a network adapter that's going to allow USB to Wi-Fi 6E. That's right, we've only just got used to Wi-Fi 6E to USB adapters, and here we are looking at another one here for 6E. So the entry point into 6E doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have to rely on your hardware manufacturer including it as a service, and not having to use PCIe cards makes it even easier to adopt. Another network solution there was from Netgear. Now, again, as mentioned, Netgear did talk a lot about their Nighthawk. They talked a lot about their Orbi system, which, again, still about. But one thing that was actually quite intriguing was their latest 2.5 gigabit Ethernet switch. Now, 2.5 GBE switches are weirdly rarer than you think. You think 1 GBE, you know, this natural progression into 2.5 GBE that's starting to happen for people that want to not, you know, flesh out all the cache for 10G, that know that 1 GBE is starting to present a bottleneck. 2.5 GBE, on switches at least, particularly multi-port 5, 8, 12, 16-port switches, is less common than you think, even though 2.5 GBE has been quite heavily adopted across end-user client hardware. It's weirdly absent in switch form. And that's why I've praised QNAP in the past for their switches, because they seem to be, although they are predominantly a NAS brand, they've released a lot of 2.5 GBE solutions, something I'll talk about later in the video. But Netgear have released this new 8-port 2.5 GBE switch, but it's PoE. Now, for those that aren't aware, PoE, Power over Ethernet, is the ability to connect devices via those network ports that don't require a separate mains power outlet, such as these cameras here in the studio. If I can point in reverse with a camera that's reversed, lots of fun. Now, this switch, the MS108EUP, has a 230 watt power delivery inside that's separated across those ports, with 4 ports being PoE plus, which is 30 watts, and 4 ports being PoE++, which is 60 watts there. So this 8-port switch, not only is it a standard PoE switch, which generally knock around for about 2 to 250 nicker, this is a 2.5 GBE 8-port switch, and because we're starting to see the increased power delivery, measured against a lot of these devices that are producing high density 4K, and therefore they need higher delivery systems that exceed that of 100 megs in some cases, when you've got shared networks at least. The idea of a PoE 2.5 GBE switch is actually quite intriguing. One thing I'm less in love with is the price. They listed it at like $440, which is crazy, and yes, that's recommended retail RRP, but still, that is very expensive for an 8-port switch. They didn't even really elaborate too much on whether it's managed or unmanaged, but this is something I'm going to keep an eye on, because I think 2.5 GBE switches are now finally starting to come down in price, and although the price of this thing seems to counter that quite extraordinarily, it's still interesting to see this development of 2.5 gigabit Ethernet moving into other devices as well. Next up, SSDs. That's right, we've talked a lot about SSDs on this channel in the last half a year or so, and let's face it, for the majority of the time this channel's been around, but now we can talk about PCIe 5 SSDs in greater detail. It's a subject that's been plinging and plogging here on the news videos for quite a while, and there were 3 brands that I want to talk about here. One, I'm going to skirt around because largely we've talked a lot about these solutions, but they were unveiled in greater detail at CES. So first up, Adata. Adata unveiled that Nighthawk and the Blackbird SSDs that we talked about, I believe, in last week or the week before's video, which is their first showing of PCIe Gen 5 SSDs. Now, alongside that, they actually gave a lot more real-world access and visibility to that Elite SE920. For those who aren't aware, although I like the idea of PCIe Gen 5 SSDs, as you know, Mobo, Asus, AS, ROC SSD motherboards start arriving on the scene, this external SSD is what really intrigued me. Now, when I talked about this, I think back in October, the Elite SE920 is a 4,000 megabytes per second external SSD. That's right, it takes advantage of USB 4, not USB 3.3 Gen 9, 6, all that nonsense. USB 4 and a 40 gigabit external drive there. So again, having an external drive that can properly take advantage of that kind of Gen 4 SSD inside is going to be really, really intriguing. And I'd be particularly intrigued to find out what is the controller that's letting those two things communicate so well. But it was good to actually see that this wasn't going to become vaporware, because if you'd looked at when they first unveiled it at their annual show, this external drive, they went really quiet on it, and it's quite an intriguing development, and they were the first to crack this record of an external USB drive that can hit those speeds. And it was one of the earliest representations of USB 4 external drives actually proving that bandwidth potential can actually be hit. Now, carrying on the subject of PCIe Gen 5 SSDs, mute the laptop, we can talk a little bit there about Samsung. Now, Samsung was always going to be one of the first brands to jump on board the PCIe Gen 5 train, not only because they're one of the biggest SSD brands in the world, but also they have a huge range of enterprise-only SSDs, part of their PM-SM series, and one of the ones they showed off very much in tech-level form was the PM1743. It's a U2 style or U3, depending on, architecture of release, style SSD that had to be delivered via an external PCIe card because ports were just not available on the test rig they were using there. Big shout out to Ryan Schroot, I apologise if I got your name wrong there, who was part of that tech team there that was showing off the speed potential of the 1743 from Samsung. They managed to hit over 13 gigabytes per second, so that's over 13,000 megabytes per second. And again, I think it reached a maximum sequential read of 13,700 or so in their testing, which is insane. And again, this isn't like an M2, this is a fully fledged chunky drive there, so don't think this is something, home or consumers or even prosumers are ever going to get advantage of. This is very much a data center-esque product there, but at the same time, you had PHISON at this event showing off their E26 and talking a lot about the architecture of a wide number of SSD controllers, and indeed PCIe Gen 4 and Gen 5 passing through techniques that are going to maximize that potential and that potential bandwidth and continue to fill up the speed that is available and possible via those PCIe lanes. So although there are a lot they were talking about there, PHISON there with those different controllers, let's obviously focus on that Gen 5 one, the E26. The E26 has a potential 12,000 megabytes per second sequential read and 11,000 megabytes per second sequential write. There or thereabouts. In terms of IOPS, they're reporting 4K random IOPS at 1.5 million, and that was read IOPS, and in write IOPS it was 2 million potential. And again, that is PHISON talking about the maximum potential of their architecture. So again, this will obviously lean into the NAND that's utilized and how each brand who utilizes this controller, because let's face it, the current generation E18 controller in Gen 4, that's used by about 40 or 50 different brands right now. So this is obviously going to be adopted gradually by the majority of those brands as well. So the architecture they go for the multi-layered NAND, because we are cracking into the 200 layers now, and of course if they go DRAMless and stuff like that in revisions of this, it's going to make a big difference about how the maximum potential of that controller can be reached, if at all, by different brands. It's also taking advantage of NVMe version 2.0. It's going to be 2.0 compliant. It reaches up to a maximum 32 terabytes capacity, an SSD with this control. Obviously, that's going to very much depend on the length there. And it's DDR4 or DDR4L memory available. It's built on an architecture of 2 ARM processors and 3 proprietary COX processors there. And again, this is going to be very much something we're going to see rolled out gradually, not only because PHISON don't really have their own SSDs, although there was an acquisition with Next Storage that we're going to talk a little bit about next week, because we've got the Next Storage drives coming in for review as well to talk about. But alongside this, PHISON and their E26 days showed off some Gen 4 and even weirdly Gen 4 times 2 drives as well, for a lot to take out in there. And again, I'm going to link to all the articles in the description below. And finally, onto network attached storage, of course. And it has to be said, there weren't hardly any brands out there in terms of, network attached storage at CES this year. The only one that made an appearance was QNAP. Now, this isn't unusual. It's been a real strange, 18, 24 months in terms of the trade show market, pandemic and COVID, and basically just businesses wondering what's the return on their investment. So again, QNAP being there, they clearly had a lot to show off, and they really did show off a lot of stuff, things that we talked about a little or a lot on the channel for the most part already. But I do think now we've got more information about them that we should give it some airtime. First and foremost, I talked about it earlier this week, a Thunderbolt 4 NAS, the TS464T4. It's a follow-up to the TS453BT3. And this is an affordable, hopefully around the $1,000 mark, 4-bay Thunderbolt 4 and 10GBE NAS system. Built on the Intel Celeron N5105 or N5095. This is an entry point into the world of Thunderbolt NAS for a lot of users, and I've done a whole dedicated video on it, and I'm genuinely intrigued to see how they're going to go on this system, because now we've learned more about its architecture. It's those M.2 lanes that are inside. It's got a couple of M.2 slots as well. We've learned more. It's going to be really intriguing to see how this lands when you compare it against the behemoth, Xeon W and Intel Core i5 6 core monsters that already exist in the Thunderbolt series to have a much more attainable Thunderbolt NAS available. But that wasn't the only thing they talked about. There is, of course, something we speculated on the channel a few months ago, based on IDs floating around online, a new silent NAS, the HS264, a new 2-bay silent NAS system utilising a very similar architecture to what we've talked about, and 2.5 GBE equipped. This is that fanless and large heat dissipating panel design 2-bay from QNAP there. The silent NASs have always been a real quirky system, and again, I was going to do a dedicated video on that device, but given I largely got, arrogantly he says, most of the specifications right when I talked about it a few months ago, I think it's best to talk about it here on the channel until we physically got one here to talk about. And again, if you're looking at a silent NAS and you're thinking, yum, going to hold out for that one, just remember, the NAS is silent, the NAS is fanless, but if you are going to utilise noisy hard drives, 8, 10, 12 TB hard drives and above, they're going to make noise, and there's nothing the NAS can do to hide that. So make sure you keep your feet on the ground. Another thing they talked about, and again something we talked about the data news of the week a few weeks ago, is that 12-bay desktop behemoth solution. Now, this is a NAS I talked about. It's a flash server. I talked about it a little before, but it still just bowls me over the specifications we're talking about here. It takes advantage of PCIe Gen 4 U2 SSDs, so whether you use the adapter that QNAP have brought out now, of course they have, or you use actual PCIe Gen 4 SSDs, because there are some brands on the market releasing them. These are SSDs that each can spit out 7,000 megabytes per second each. Think of that in a 12-bay solution there. The CPU inside is either it's between an 8 and a 16 core AMD processor in there, highfalutin bit there, and hundreds of gigabytes of memory as well. It can be scaled up to, I think this might even hit either a terabyte or half a terabyte. I haven't got that on my notes, I'm afraid. Now, again, this in terms of external bandwidth, it has two 25 GBE ports there. That's right, not 2.5, 25 gigabit Ethernet. So that's a fiber-based connection there, which again, of course, you can lag to get up to 50 GB connection, which is insane. Also on top of that, alongside those U2 ports all being PCIe 4, the system also has 4 PCIe upgrade slots that are all PCI Gen 4. There's 3 Gen 4 times 16 slots and 1 times 4 slot there. So the upgradability of this to take advantage of 100 GBE cards or multi-port fiber channel 25G cards there, insane. This is a system that has the horsepower inside to really make the most of that high bandwidth media inside, but also, you know, limitless external upgradability. There are going to be no bottlenecks inside and out with a flash server like this, and it makes it not only the most powerful desktop NAS I've ever seen, but on top of that, probably the best flash server in the market right now. And I'm including rack mounts in that as well. Now, to close, there were a couple of other things from the QNAP stand there, both of which are very niche, but still one more interesting than another. Let's be honest. Let's go for the quirkier of the two, the KoiBox. I've never really understood the KoiBox system. I think in a pandemic world it makes more sense, but I think it's very difficult to integrate a system like that without making it larger, and therefore talking about it in this small way, the KoiBox conference system gets very, very tough. In of itself, it's intriguing. It is a box there where it can be utilised for video conferencing, both remotely and inside your office and business, integrated with mobile phones and applications as well as completely cross and integratable with the likes of Zoom, Skype, Teams, that sort of thing. And it allows communication and meetings to be held rather than utilising third-party software, all being kept in-house, all utilising that kind of internal communication system, so everything can be encrypted, everything can be recorded locally. It has internal SSD bays as well. You don't need to have more than one. Of course, you can have one at different locations, and everyone communicate on the premises via that box. And also it supports Wi-Fi 6, which is a nice little upgrade. But still, I think it's a hard sell to ask people to move away from the likes, again, of Zoom, Teams, that sort of thing, and their, unquestionable convenience towards something like this. I think there is a market for this, but I'm not quite sure I can pin it down completely. And again, post-pandemic world makes a lot more sense with people working remotely more, but still, it's a big ask when you think of the convenience of a simple subscription to Zoom, but we'll have to find out. And then, of course, there was their own switch. They were talking more and more about their latest generation of switches. They've got new 25 GBE switches, which is crazy. This new PoE switch that's got 4 10 GBE ports and a full complement of 2.5 GBE ports makes it incredibly intriguing. But they also showed off a bunch of other switches as well. And ultimately, when it comes to CES 2022 this year, although it's been a little bit safer than previous years, it's still a lot more going on than I genuinely thought there would be at CES. Now, where do we go from here? Well, let's look at the rest of the year, moving slightly away from CES there. There's gonna be new Synologies. Later this year, it's, look at their release cycle. I'll be very, very surprised if we don't see a new 2022 plus desktop series of disk stations, if not announced, then released before summer. We're talking June, July. But on top of that, the value series. There's some stuff going on, both QNAP and Synology. We're seeing model IDs, we're seeing certain hardware components, particularly ARM components there, starting to move around. And I think it's fairly clear that there's going to be new value series from both Synology and QNAP announced in the very near future. And we are talking maybe not so much J's, but definitely your standard values to replace the existing range of Realtek solutions. And with QNAP, although they have a multifaceted value series, I think we can definitely see follow-ups to a lot of those value systems of a similar architecture and design, with a new generation of those ARM processors coming into the market. And again, watch this space. I definitely think we're talking March, April for, if not a formal announcement, then full-on release for some of that stuff. But do stay tuned for that. But this has been Data News of the Week CES Special. If you want to learn more, click subscribe and the bell to be notified. And otherwise, I will see you at the next video.